the importance of substance abuse can be both overestimated and underestimated with a domestic batterer. The way it gets overestimated is when people think that it's the substance abuse that's causing him to become an abuser. And there's no substance that can turn a non-abusive man into an abuser. It can make someone a very difficult partner in other ways, but it's not going to make him start to show this whole pattern that defines what abuse is. So the mistake sometimes gets made of saying, oh, well, now that I know that he's an addict, like that's what we need to attend to is the addiction. That's not true. He's got two problems. He's an abuser and he's got an addiction. The woman will sometimes pin her hopes on getting him sober and believe that that's going to make everything okay. And so we have to gently warn her that that's not going to do it. That's tough for her because she needs whatever she can grab onto to hold on to hope, and we're snatching another source of hope away. And I also have mixed feelings about that process because, yeah, we don't want her attached to false hope. On the other hand, she's got to get through the day. And we're just pulling something. She just feels like, oh, you're trying to pull something else away from me that gets me through the day. So I always say, like, for anything you're taking away from her, try to be given something back. Even if it's just extra support from you. Even if it's more like, I'm here for you, and I know this is really hard to hear. Now, the way it gets underestimated, two ways that substance abuse gets underestimated. First of all, it's dangerous. And every study that's been done of domestic violence homicide finds that a heavy degree of substance abuse is one of the top predictors of which batterers will kill. So while it's not a cause, it has to be taken very seriously as a contributing factor to which abusers get the most dangerous. And the other way that it's really significant is that the substance abusing batterer does not change. And according to the research, not only does he not change from the batterer program, he doesn't even change from jail. And by the way, the research says that if you have to choose like abuser program or jail, and you can't have both, that jail and no abuser program works better than abuser program and no jail. That may surprise you coming from someone whose career was largely devoted to abuser intervention. I prefer both, and actually there's at least one study indicating that both is more effective than either separately. And then I'm going to say something similar with respect to mental illness, which is that mental illness is not causative of domestic violence. There's no diagnosis that would fit what an abuser is like. When therapists want to do therapy with abusers, which I wish they wouldn't do, they have to really stretch things in the diagnostic manual to come up with a diagnosis to bill from. One thing that really does matter with respect to his mental health is suicidality. And the reason it matters, again, is because it's really dangerous. Abusers do not commit suicide. They commit murder-suicide. If he decides to kill himself, he's going to be trying to take somebody else with him, and it's usually going to be her. About a fifth of the time, if he decides to kill her, he's also going to try to kill one or more of her children, according to 2 different studies. You can already tell from certain things I've said that the abuser really affects how everybody gets along with everybody else in the family. And one of the things that he particularly affects is the mother's attempt to mother her kids. He's a counter-parent. Whatever it is she's trying to do, he's going to try to work against. I like to point out these 4 dynamics in particular. One is the undermining of her maternal authority. Abuse, by its very nature, will automatically undermine her authority, but then on top of that, he will also, quite likely, make efforts to further deliberately undermine her authority. Kids learn that dad or stepdad says, we don't got to do what mom said. Or they're in the midst of an argument with mom and the abuser sides with them. That reinforces the difficulties that she's having managing the kids. The kids, as I said, are being taught to disrespect her. That makes her parenting life more challenging. The kids are being traumatized. That makes her parenting life more challenging because they become more challenging people, behaviorally and emotionally. Unfortunately, it's common for professionals making an assessment who don't understand these dynamics to decide that she is an ineffective parent and that she just lets the kids run all over her and run all over her and run all over her until she finally can't stand anymore, and then she screams at them, and that she hits them, and that she doesn't have anything in between, either doing nothing or losing it with them. If that's what we're seeing, and we know or have very strong reason to suspect that dad or stepdad is an abuser, then we should make a completely different interpretation of what we're observing. It doesn't make sense to say, oh, mom's problem is that she's a poor limit setter if her maternal authority is being completely sabotaged. And it's certainly not going to do any good to send her to a parenting class to help her learn strategies for reestablishing her parental authority, while he's going to continue to cut it out from under her. So we really have to be aware of this dynamic. Next, the interference with her parenting. Parenting is not just about authority. In fact, when things are going nice in the family, it's not even that much about authority. Parenting is about loving, it's about nurturing, it's about providing meals, it's about driving, it's about helping resolve conflicts, it's about all kinds of stuff. Well, he gets in the way of all that stuff too. Using the children as weapons. So this is things like he's mad at her, so he starts to hurt the kids, knowing that that's actually what's most likely to make her back off. It's also behaviors like saying, if you ever leave me, I'm going to disappear, you're going to have no money, you're not going to be able to support these kids. Or if you ever leave me, I'm going to go for custody. And as we know, in our time, that's a very serious threat. There's a very good chance that he will win. Probably the most common complaint that I hear in this category is driving really scary with the kids in the car because he's mad at her, but he knows that that's going to really scare the piss out of her, that he's doing that with the kids in the car. And then the sowing of divisions, turning people in the family against each other. He's a power monger in the home, and so this is just a real divide and conquer kind of strategy. Favoritism is one of the big ways he does this. You'll often find when you ask more questions that he's treating one of the children really different from the other kids. Favorite child, more commonly a boy than a girl, but it's not always a boy. Although, when the favored child is a girl, I would ask you to just be a little more on alert about how her boundaries are being handled, because it can be a grooming. She may be a favorite because she's being selected for grooming. Another big source of divisions is collective punishment. So collective punishment is the thing where you punish the whole family because of what one person did. They're going to go on a canoe trip that day. Dad gets pissed at mom, so the canoe trip is canceled. And so it actually diverts people's resentment away from the tyrant and towards each other. And so if the canoe trip gets canceled, then the kids are going to be at mom, like, why did you start a fight with him today of all days? Like, you knew that would wreck our canoe trip. If you know how he would get if you fought with him today, why couldn't you just let it go? And then the third way that he sows divisions is simply by the overt sowing of divisions, which is telling people in the family bad things about other people in the family, telling them lies, whatever, getting them stirred up against each other. Client of mine, this one was especially insidious because the girl was coming to him for help. 2 teen girls who had been very close when they were younger had grown apart as teenagers. And one of the girls said to her dad about how upset she was, I feel like it's because she's jealous that I have a boyfriend and she doesn't. And she was expressing this as a call for help, like, how should I handle this? Like, he goes to the other daughter and says, your sister says you're jealous that she has a boyfriend and you don't. Something she shared with him, looking for help her and her sister get closer, he realizes, oh, here's my opportunity to blow them farther apart. So I encourage people, anytime they're working with a family, to ask questions about all 4 of these items. Abusers will vary in how much of this they will do. Some of them will be much worse than others, and they will vary in which tactics they use. I think these questions are still too general. I wouldn't ask, does he undermine your authority? I would ask 3 or 4 specific examples under there. Do you tell the children they have to go to bed? And he says, no, they don't. Or you tell them they can stay up late because the cousins are over, and he says, no, I don't care if the cousins are over. They still have to go to, in other words, he can undermine her in the looser direction or the tighter direction. That'll still completely undermine her authority. So I gave you examples under each of these. So use those examples with her. Does he seem to favor a child? Give her specifics, because then it'll start to click. But the other thing I notice about this is, even if she says no to all of it, even the more specific questions, she's still saying no, you are giving her a whole diagnostic matrix, a whole way of thinking about what's going on. And what's going to happen is, in the next couple weeks, she's suddenly going to start to see it because you asked her about it and now she has language for it. She'll think, oh, he does do that. And sometimes it'll click, oh, in fact, he's been doing that all along. I'm not saying that all child welfare offices are like this or all states are like this. Certainly not all workers are like this. So many child welfare workers are trying so hard to do the right thing with the absurd number of cases that they've been handled. The child welfare system, like most of the society, fundamentally thinks of mothers as being responsible for children's well-being. The dad is kind of like a secondary potential source of assistance. The community is sort of a potential secondary source of assistance, but it's on mom. So if things are going wrong, then it's mom's fault. So she's very likely to encounter various ways that she's being blamed, even for her partner's behavior. If she is dark-skinned, or if she is from great poverty, she is likely to encounter significant race and class prejudice. And folks who are particularly interested in the race prejudice issues, I would encourage you to read Shattered Bonds. And the subtitle of that book is The Color of Child Welfare. The class prejudice I've just run into all the time. Like any big system, the child welfare system is responding partly to where they're most concerned about the potential of lawsuit. And when they're dealing with very low-income families, they know they're very unlikely to get sued. And when they're dealing with very wealthy families, they suddenly get extremely cautious. So you find poor women being treated, you find children sometimes being pulled from homes because of the parents' poverty. It's like, well, you're not being able to give them a very nice environment here. Oh, you know, lovely. There's been a big effort for decades now to train child protective systems on responding to domestic violence. That's been very successful some places, not very successful other places. We cannot assume that a worker has been well prepared in the dynamics of domestic violence, and we cannot assume that the worker's supervisor, particularly if you've got a supervisor who's been around for 20 years, you often have a supervisor who's very locked into, well, this is how we do things, this is how we've always done things. And so I end up a fair bit at trainings with a worker saying to me, I want to be handling this case the way we've been talking about today. I can't, like my office doesn't let me do that. Now, some child welfare offices have like a domestic violence specialist, an embedded specialist in the office. It's just something to keep pushing for at the policy level to the extent that you have any influence, what you call the embedded advocate. But their job, her job, it's usually a she, her job is to advocate for the abused women in the child welfare caseload. That's her whole job. It becomes a huge resource for workers. They like having the embedded advocate there. They know to go to that person when they realize they're in a domestic violence case and they're not sure what to do. So best practice nationally, and this is true in a number of states, but not a lot, it's true in a few states, is that once it's a domestic violence case, we put the regular protocol aside and we're supposed to follow this entirely alternate protocol. Oklahoma is the national leader, in my opinion, on this question, and they are happy to share their so-called purple book with other states. And their purple book is their protocol. It's terrific. It's absolutely terrific. It's their protocol for the handling of domestic violence cases. So you can try to pressure your child welfare system to get the purple book or to even bring in trainers from Oklahoma, bring in Jacqueline Stein if they can from Oklahoma. For women who live way out in the country, there's often almost nothing. Child welfare, again, no fault of the worker, but the worker often just doesn't have much to give her. She often, in our times, going to be put under very intense pressure to leave the abuser and a lot of criticism if she can't or doesn't wish to do that or doesn't think it's a good idea to do that. Now, if she does leave the abuser and he is suddenly fighting for custody in court, child welfare is no longer there. Child welfare's philosophy nationwide, there may be pockets where this isn't true, but the essential philosophy nationwide is we're only responsible for what happens in a custodial home. If there's something bad happening to these children in a non-custodial home, that's the responsibility of the family court. I'm not saying I agree with this, but I'm saying this is what child welfare people will typically tell you state after state. And you try to tell them, yeah, but except the family court does not have a protective approach. They don't even consider their job child protection. Now, we can't take on what's going on in a non-custodial home. That's their sense. They should not be requiring her to do any form of counseling in which he is also present. Next, they should not be sending him to anger management. But I'm going to tell you what I think are roughly the top 8 responsibilities that an abuser program has. To do an assessment of his lethality and try to figure out how great a danger he is to kill. To contact the victim if they can reach her, to try to share information and education with her about what an abuser is about, and to try to connect her to advocacy. He needs to be educated that his abusiveness is a product of his attitudes, and he needs to have those attitudes confronted. He needs to be educated about the effect that his behavior is having on the woman, what the effects of violence are, and abuse are, and how he's damaging her. He needs to have education about the damage that he's doing to his kids just by mistreating their mother, and the fact that he's responsible for that. 0 of these things will happen in an anger management program. 0. That's not a criticism of anger management. It's a different program. Judges will say, well, we prefer to use the anger management program. Why? Well, because it's so much shorter and it's a lot less expensive. So I say, okay, say that your feet have been killing you for 5 years, but the podiatrist is really expensive. And you find out that the eye, ear, nose, and throat specialist is a lot cheaper. Do you go to the eye, ear, nose, and throat specialist? No. Why? Because it's the wrong doc. So you know what would be even cheaper? Send him to cooking classes. Why don't you send him to cooking classes? They're typically going to want to send both parents to parent education courses. They've heard that moms who are being abused run into some parenting challenges, like I've talked to you about today. They haven't heard enough of analysis of why. So they're going to think, oh, I'm going to send her to a parenting class, and that's going to help her manage these kids. It's not going to help much at all, because whatever she tries to do, he's going to continue to try to undo, but also because they're talking generically, and she's living in a very specific set of circumstances. And they're going to say things to her like, you really have to focus with your partner on being a united front with those kids. Well, how's she going to do that? She can't be a united front with the kids, with this guy. Some of the things they're going to tell her will not only not work, some of the things that they're going to tell her are going to be actively bad advice, again, just because of the specifics of her circumstances. An abused woman needs a parenting group that's for abused moms. And that is something that's available very few places. Now, okay, so they may have heard that batterers tend to not be great parents, so let's send him to a parenting education class. The problem there is that batterers don't tend to be poor parents because they're ignorant about parenting skills. Teaching them a bunch of parenting skills isn't going to change all the problems in his attitude. And he needs a program much more like Caring Dads. I don't know if you've heard about Caring Dads, but Caring Dads is a program that focuses on the fundamental message there is that the father, before you can do anything better as a caring dad, is you have to accept responsibility for your actions. That's the first tenet of Caring Dads. This is a program out of Ontario, but it's in various places in the U.S. too. What happens when he goes to a parenting education class is he collects things to use against the woman. Ooh, she doesn't do that. Ooh, they said she's not supposed to do that, and she's doing this. And the other thing he gets from his parenting education class is dates. They pick up women at their parenting education class. So just the way she needs a parenting group that's specifically for abused women, he needs a parenting group that's specifically for abusers. It's really going to fall to the abuser program to do parenting work with him. But the main focus has to be on teaching him about the effects that his treatment of mom is having on the kids, trying to break through his callousness about what the kids are going through. In other words, just get him to be more caring and sensitive about their feelings and experiences, and teaching him about proper co-parenting. How do you share decision-making with another person instead of bullying the mom into doing things how you want them to do? And then there's some specific things that can happen in normal parenting class that we don't want to do with abusers. For example, in a normal parenting class, he's going to tend to hear quite a bit about how important fathers are and how crucial they are to children's development and how children really need a father. Well, I think that's a good message in certain ways for a non-abusive dad. It's not a good message for an abuser to hear. Where he goes with that is, ooh, I'm going to go for custody here because now I understand how important, I've heard all this great stuff about how important fathers are. The other thing that he would learn often in a general parenting education class is strategies for getting his kids to open up to him. That's one of the things you learn in parent education is how do you create a context where your kids are going to be comfortable telling you how they really feel about things. I don't want to teach that to an abuser. Kids do better, the less they expose themselves to their abusive dad. In fact, we want kids to learn to trust their own radar, right? And their own radar is saying, don't open up to him too much. We want them to trust that. We don't want him to learn techniques for how to get them to feel like, no, you can tell me stuff. Because it's not a good idea to tell him too much. A woman's relationship with child welfare often ends up being pretty tense. That doesn't end up helping the kids. That ends up really backfiring against the kids in a number of ways. I think the best practices and the trends where in the places where child welfare is being handled more progressively is towards really trying to get out of that and trying to really focus on how do we have a collegial teamwork kind of relationship with the mom. And rather than coming in saying, okay, you have to do this on Monday, here's your schedule for the week. You have to go to this Mondays, you have to go to this Tuesdays, you have to go to this Wednesdays, this Thursdays, Fridays. You have to leave him by 3 weeks from Friday, or you might lose your children, et cetera. Where right away, you're in this stance, and she's in this stance, right? There's a real move, in certain places at least, away from that. Because realizing it doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help the worker, it doesn't help mom, it doesn't help the kids. And to go to an adversarial relationship only when nothing else is working and the children are in serious danger. That's the only time it makes sense to go to an adversarial relationship. And I understand, sometimes there's no choice. Sometimes the risk the kids are going to get killed or that something at that level of severity is going to happen Sometimes there's no choice but to say, you have to do this and this, or we're doing this. What welfare agencies are finding is that the better systems they have in place and the better they understand what an abused mom is up against, the fewer times they're ending up going that way. And so an adversarial stance that used to be almost typical, in some places has become actually quite unusual. They're finding they rarely need to go there. It doesn't work very well either to get in really tense relationships with him. It's different in an abuser program. In an abuser program, we do get in somewhat tense relationships with our clients, but we're going to see them every week for an hour and a half or 2 hours. We're having a chance to build a relationship with them. We're having a chance to follow up the next week. Wow, things were tense when you left here last week. Let's talk about that so that you can try to work through stuff. But otherwise, in other circumstances, things get tense with him. The only effect that it has is to inflame him. One thing that continues to challenge me on the street, because if I see something happening that really looks domestic violence-ish to me, not an outright assault, because then I know what to do, but if I see things that really look domestic violence-ish, and I just walk on by, I feel like I'm colluding. But if I involve myself, I'm probably not the one who's going to pay for that. She's probably the one who's going to pay for that. So it's so hard. The options in those situations are really unpleasant because nothing feels, and I can't tell you what the right answer is. I don't think there is any clear right answer in those situations. It's so hard to know what to do. Sometimes we have opportunities to make eye contact with the victim, and then we can communicate all kinds of things just with our eyes to let her know, hey, I see what's going on here, I'm with you. It doesn't make sense to try to be the hero in those situations because what we will do is inflame him. One of the fundamental principles about abuser confrontation, abusers don't care if they're confronted unless they're being confronted by somebody they care about, such as a friend or a relative, or they're being confronted by someone whom they perceive as being in a position of authority. One of the other advantages that we have in batterer counseling is that often we have the pressure of the entire group on him. When you have a well-run batterer group, the guys start to pressure each other. So let's talk about some of what we really want to press child welfare to be doing. I've already said, teamwork with her. They should be educating her about domestic violence. They should be educating every mother in their caseload about domestic violence, even in cases where they have no reason to suspect domestic violence, because it may be going on whether they know about it or not. But the other reason is that then that'll puts them in a position to say to every mother, we go over this with every mother. And that way she doesn't have to get in a defensive position like, well, no, but this isn't going on in my house. For those of you who haven't had much contact with the child welfare system, parents' initial orientation is fear that their kids are going to get taken away. And so their initial orientation is deny everything. So if you start asking about domestic violence, that's just another thing to answer no to. So she's gotten to know you and has some reason to trust that you actually have her best interests at heart. So if you do certain kinds of basic education with her, but say this is what we do in all our cases, then she doesn't have to admit to anything. There are so many women who describe to me their life in 2 stages, before they saw the power and control wheel and since they saw the power and control wheel. Those are like the 2 most identifiable stages in her life. So you can do so much in 15 or 20 minutes with something like the power and control wheel, and then explaining some other basic concepts, like some of the things I talked about today, like the fact that he lives his script, and that you're not going to affect the trajectory of where it goes. If he gets worse, he gets worse. If he gets better, he gets better. It's not going to be because of what you did. She doesn't have to be ready to hear it. Those seeds get planted in there, and they're going to start to grow. You may run into situations where the woman is actually being required by child welfare to go to victim services. She's saying, no, there's not a problem, it's not a domestic violence case, or I don't want to go, and they're requiring her to go anyhow. I'm actually not entirely against this. I used to be, but I'm not anymore. Those of us who work in domestic violence don't take easily to her being required to do this, because one of our sort of fundamental tenets is, why would someone be required to do something because of something that was done to them? The issue is that there's kids in this picture, and the kids have rights and needs also. It's not just about her. The reason I gradually stopped being opposed to this, for 2 reasons. One is, I talked to a fair number of women who said, I was required to go down to the battered women's group, and actually, eventually, I'm glad that I was. It also allows her to go to the program while staying in good with the abuser. And any way that she can stay in good with the abuser makes her life go better. So if she can say to him, I don't want to go to that stupid group. I think that group is dumb, but it says here that I gotta go. So then she can kiss up to him and get to go to her group. So that's a nice thing for her. And then the other thing was I came across a study. And And a substantial percentage of women said that they were glad that they had been required to go. This is something that people outside of the child welfare system can definitely be helpful with. Help her understand that other things that she's got going on are going to count against her in the child welfare process. And that if she's got an addiction problem, it would greatly strengthen her position if she would attend to that. If she really needs mental health help or employability help, these are things that are going to count in your favor if you attend to them and are going to count against you if you don't. For folks who are not domestic violence advocates and want to learn more about it, these are two amazing books. They're both by Jill Davies. This one she has a co-author on, Eleanor Lyon. I wish 30 years ago that this was the first thing someone had handed me when I came into work in domestic violence. This would have helped me in my work with perpetrators more than anything else I read. It's just such a clear delineation of what an abused woman is actually dealing with and what's actually going to help and what's not actually going to help. Try to notice if the welfare system's approach is strictly deficit-oriented, if all they're collecting about her is the things that she's done wrong. One of the roles the advocate can play, well, have you looked at her strengths? Do you realize that she's already left him 3 times before, and that one time she stayed away from him for 2 months? That shows that she is at least capable of seeking help and is attempting to seek help. Do you know that she brought in a family support worker for months into her house? She can draw resources in. Have you talked to this woman about her kids? Do you realize how much she cares about her kids? She cries when she's talking about them. Do you know that there's been times when he was about to hurt the children and she intentionally got him mad at her so that he would hurt her instead of hurting the kids? They often are not going to be in any way aware of, and it's not counting in her favor. One of the things that I'll make sure you get is a whole list, all the different techniques that women use, abused women use to protect their children. So let me say a couple things about that list. First of all, you won't agree with everything that's on that list. There are things on there where you will think, oh, I really wish she wouldn't do that. That's fine. You have the right to your own opinion about that. It's on the list even though it's probably not a good idea, just so you will recognize it as an attempt to protect. So that rather than labeling her as someone who doesn't care or isn't trying to or won't try to protect her children, you think, oh, she is trying. She's doing some things I wish she wouldn't do. Let's have a conversation about that, rather than just labeling her someone who doesn't care. I recommend using this list in 3 ways. One is to go through it with her and find things on there that she has tried and give her some credit for those. An abused mother really gets no credit or praise from anywhere. She gets criticism or nothing. Second, think with her about things that are on the list that she hasn't tried that maybe she could try. And then the third way to use it is to try to identify things that it might not be a good idea to use, or if she's already using them, might be a good idea to give up. But again, trying to understand that those are well-intentioned. When a mother, for example, tells her kids that certain things didn't happen, oh no, he didn't hit me, she's trying to relieve their pain. She gets labeled as, oh, she's joining him in his denial. That's not usually where she's coming from. Maybe for some moms, that's where they're coming from. Usually she's coming from, that would just be too painful for them to know that, so I'm going to tell them he didn't do it, and then they'll hurt less. And then we need to supportively explain to her why that's not going to go where she wishes it would go. We have to help her understand where that goes, but in a kind way, not like in a, don't do that. Do you know what that's going to cause your kids? Which is the tone she'll get from certain people in her life, and that's not what she needs. The research on children's exposure to domestic violence finds them having higher levels than other kids, on average, of virtually every measure of childhood distress. Depression, substance abuse, running away from home, self-harming behaviors, school attention problems, school behavior problems. However, they don't show dramatically higher levels of those than other children. They only show slightly higher level than other children of this huge range of measures of childhood distress. So what does that tell us? It tells us that kids are having super variable reactions to these circumstances. It means there are a lot of factors that play in. How dangerous and terrifying is the abuser? How much is he making the children feel that they're to blame? How much is he succeeding in turning them against their moms? What are their own strengths as people, the kids? It would be a mistake to take the situation lightly, obviously, but it's also a mistake to treat every situation as a disaster where we've got to remove the kids, knowing that one of the worst things that can happen to those kids is to be taken from their mother. By the way, every study in domestic violence that has looked at the question of the protective factors for children who are witnessing domestic violence find that the closer they are to their mother, the better they do. By the way, I could only find one study that looked at the effects of being closer to their father, but the one study I did found that the closer they are to their father, the worse they do. this sort of notion that, well, these kids need to be close to their dad too is just not supported by anything when you're looking at domestic violence cases. We've got so many studies that have shown, and no studies that have failed to show this. If they've looked at the question, they have found that one of the top protective factors is how close they are to their moms. So that we've always got to think of that as really, in many ways, our top priority is how do we help these kids have as close and sustained a relationship with their mom as is possible. What that means is that we want to pressure child welfare systems to not just be like, oh, these children are being exposed to domestic violence, that's horrible, we got to get them out of there. But to do spectrum thinking and to do low and medium and high risk and then match the intervention to the level of danger. How do we not know, like, where would we put it on the spectrum? Well, they should do a lethality assessment of the abuser. What are her abilities to at least attempt to protect, and what's her ability to draw on resources? Then, how are the children doing? And then, how much have the children been directly exposed to the abuse? These are things that potentially you can push the child welfare system about. Well, have you done this? Have you properly done this assessment before you started talking about these intense interventions and before you started criticizing the mom and pressuring her to leave him? There was a court ruling, it was years ago now, it must be 15 years ago now, that child welfare services cannot remove children from homes in order to punish parents for not cooperating with child welfare. They can only remove children from homes because the children have to be removed from that home. In other words, because the situation is dangerous enough, physically or sexually, emotionally, that they have to be pulled. But not because you're mad at mom that she didn't do this or that or the other thing, and you're going to punish her for not cooperating by pulling the children. Children, like their moms, need what you would call a psychoeducational group, meaning it needs to have a mixture of kind of what we would think of as emotional healing and therapy, discussing emotions, getting emotional support, doing the crying they need to do, and so forth, with ideas that they need to learn, with cognitive stuff, particularly with education about who's responsible, but a bunch of other stuff that's more like information. What is abuse? Like, what's okay and not okay in a home? What's okay for how a person treats their intimate partner in a dating situation or a marriage? Children need this experience. Need this information, particularly boys, since we know that they're at risk to become perpetrators. But we talked this morning about why that information is really important for girls too, so that they don't blame themselves. How do we want to run these groups and how do we pay for them? So it's tricky. First of all, I'll talk about funding. Funding tends to require collaboration. The ideal group is run by a male-female team because that gives kids a really good model of male and female mutual respect and cooperation. And the ideal pairing is a domestic violence advocate with a mental health professional. You don't have to have the ideal picture. You don't necessarily need a male and female team. You don't necessarily need the therapist and the advocate there. 2 advocates can run a group. I would not have 2 mental health professionals run the group. Any time that we could have a male-female team and an advocate and a mental health professional, that was great. Generally, groups need to be divided into at least 2 age categories. You're generally going to start with kids around age 4, and the younger group will go up to maybe 9 or 10, and then the older group will go up to maybe 11 and up to 17. The groups need a curriculum so that you're presenting information every day, and then discussion time, same as you might do in a group for abused women, where kids can learn to identify emotions and articulate them and learn that that just help them know what they're feeling and have names for it, which already helps them a lot. But then in a context also where they get to talk and tell some of their stories about what's happened in their house. They need a lot of opportunity to talk about that stuff and process that stuff. And they need education about manipulation. They need education about who's responsible for all this, like we already talked about. The thing I would most like to tell you is that, and I've never run one of these groups, but I've talked to people all over the country who lead them, and everybody who does it loves it. I don't think I've ever heard of anything, at least not in the domestic violence field, but I've rarely heard of anything in any field where the people who were doing the work were expressing so much satisfaction to me. One of the things that kids most expressed to Carolyn McGee in her interviews was they wanted to get to talk to other kids who had lived with a batterer in the home. So the group immediately does that by its very nature. Okay, so funding. I've seen them done as collaborations between a mental health center and a domestic violence program, and that can help sometimes with funding. A certain amount of insurance billing can happen, or different things can happen than grants. I've seen it done as a collaboration between child welfare and a mental health center, and I've seen it done as a collaboration between child welfare and a domestic violence program. How I've seen that work, is that, say it's going to be 8 kids in the group, child welfare then, because they're providing funding, owns a certain number of seats in the group, like maybe 4 of them are reserved for child welfare or whatever cases. That gives you 4 more seats for anybody in the community. Odd collaboration, but it was a really good group in Methuen, Mass, northeastern Massachusetts, between a Batterer program, but a very pro-victim Batterer program, and a hospital. Anything that happens at hospitals has the additional advantage that it's an easy thing for women to deal with under the radar without the abuser knowing it, because she can claim she's going for health care. In fact, I don't know if this is where else this is true, but certainly in the Boston area, all the hospitals offer battered women's support groups in the hospital. There is not really nearly the quality and quantity of published curriculum materials for groups for children of battered women. So you largely have to create your own curriculum. Unfortunately, people are reinventing the wheel all over the country, which is really too bad. In the meantime, there's a little starting curriculum in a book called Group Work with Children of Battered Women, Einat Peled, P-E-L-E-D. It has very helpful guidance to how to decide which kids are appropriate for group and which kids are not. You'll have kids that would not be appropriate for the group because of the impact they would have on the group. They would just be too disruptive or too intense, or they've almost been through some things that are too horrible, that are going to be too disturbing. The kids are going to be somewhat disturbed by each other's stories, of course, but there's a limit. And then occasionally there are kids where the group would not be good for them because of the impact the group would have on them, because they're just too raw and sensitive, or because the abuser is too opposed to them being in the group, and that's going to blow up in the kid's face. Kids will go to groups secretly sometimes, and I'm not opposed to that, but everyone has to be aware, kids and mom have to be aware of the risks that are involved in that. If he hears about it, he's nowadays likely to take legal steps to make it stop. If they're split up, which is one of the best chances for the children to heal, so when they're split up is one of the best times for them to be in a group, is unfortunately also one of the times when he has the best chance of being able to prevent it. He runs down to the family court and says, I don't want my kids in this group, there was no domestic violence, and this program is trying to convince my kids that I'm a batterer, and the court will very often say, okay, to the mom, you can't send your kids to that group. All right, I have to tell you my favorite story about this. And these 3 siblings, when they had been about 7, 9, and 11 years old, they had started going to a group for children of battered women, and only a few weeks into that, by a nasty coincidence, their father won custody of them. And they went to live with their father, and for the next 2 years, they actually didn't even get to have much contact with their mother. Now, this was a mom who re-won custody of her children. I wish I heard that story a lot more often than I do. I can't claim I hear it a lot. But 2 years later, she won custody back. They didn't tell her this until they were safely back living with her. During the 2 years that they'd been living at his house, they continued going on foot every Wednesday night to their group for children of battered women, telling their father that they were going to the library. And they told her that they felt like during the time that they were cut off from her, that group was what held them. And they just said they felt like they would have been totally wrecked if they hadn't had access to that group during those 2 years. Well, to me, that story speaks so beautifully to the courage and ingenuity of the oppressed. Like that was brave of them to do that. That's what I call very creative misbehavior. And it required solidarity, because if any of them had blown the secret, they all would have been in big trouble. It speaks to their judgment, like they knew this, we need this, like this helps us. I also think it's a lovely comment on the parenting of men who batter. If my children, every Wednesday night for 2 years, had left the house telling me that they were going to the library, I would have started to have some questions about this. And it just says so much about him that he didn't.